On that note, I will take a seat and kick off our discussion. So let me start with Oscar, who, as I said, leads the stock exchange in Nigeria and chairs the African Securities and Exchange Association. So why don't you've talked hopefully here and hopefully excited enough people about the opportunities on the continent. Can you share with us then what strategies global and domestic institutional investors are using to access in particular capital markets in Africa?
Thank you very much, Archer. Let me start by thanking Mr. Dansu and the team from Africa Investor for inviting me to participate in the discussions today. We see a number of strategies emerging on the continent from institutional investors, from index tracking to asset allocation strategies to participation in private equity and product diversification. If you look at the index tracking space, there are over 30 indices that track various African markets, from exchange flagship indices to international indexes that have created indices to track the various segments of the African markets, from MSCI to FTSE to S&P to Reuters. And what we note is that some fund managers tend to track some of these international indices. For example, the MSCI Frontier Market Index, which has returned about 4%, has African components in it, to the S&P All Africa Index, which has returned almost 9%. And that tracks almost all of the listed companies on the continent. From an asset allocation strategy perspective, I think in 2016, BlackRock survey said that 1 in 4 institutional investors intend to decrease cash in 2017 and make significant shifts in less liquid assets and higher yielding strategies. We're already seeing longer duration, high yield municipals outperforming most fixed income sectors year to date. And globally, 28% of investors intend to increase their allocation to active equities relative to passive equities. So even though we've seen a lot of people tracking indices, we are beginning to see people move away, given the current market conditions, to actively managed funds. And they're willing to pay the higher fees to do that if it will get them the higher alpha that they need. What we also see, if you look at the largest pension fund in Africa, for example, the government employees pension fund, which has about $111 billion US in AUM, there's significant investments in unlisted and developmental assets. And so we're seeing movements in African pension funds beginning to make significant allocations to private equity. In Nigeria, for example, the new regulations allow pension funds to invest up to 5% of their AUM in private equity. We know in South Africa that number is going from 2.5% to 10%. And this is true for most of the countries where you have developing pension fund industries. Asset diversification is another big area. In most of the markets in Africa, you are beginning to see people create new product categories that we did not have before. For example, exchange-traded funds, REITs is a good one. Again, in Nigeria, we have the S&P Nigeria Sovereign Bond Index that has now been issued as an ETF and has a significant institutional following. The New Gold ETF, which is listed across Africa from Johannesburg to Lagos to Nairobi and other centers, is another one where institutional investors are tracking and giving themselves an opportunity to get exposure in your non-traditional asset classes like equities. We note that there's also significant movement in the area of infrastructure. A lot of the institutional investors are also beginning to get exposure in that space. You know, the World Bank says that about $93 billion is needed on an annual basis for Africa to invest in infrastructure, and the Africa Development Bank believes that there is a $50 billion gap in order to meet that target. And so they've created the Africa 50 Fund, for example, that targets about $10 billion US dollars, and really that is designed to be deployed in the infrastructure space. All of these are actually getting exposure in the capital markets in Africa. So I think I've just tried to give an overview of what is going on the continent from where I sit in ASEA. And ASEA is the African Securities Exchanges Association that covers 27 exchanges across the continent and has over 1.3 trillion US dollars in market cap.
No, thanks also, that's very helpful as a sort of continental overview of what's happening.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.